This is going to be a great experiment. That works. That's wonderful. We've got this wonderful opportunity now for questions from the audience. We've also got people over there tweeting. I know John is typing away, and he'll probably do a bit of question selection. So questions from the floor for the more nervous people amongst you. I'm going to be sort of the wonderful assistant now as well. I'm going to run around the room with this great microphone. In fact, which is the best? That one? That one? Right, okay. So if we could start with you putting your hands up if you want to ask a question, and then give me a few seconds to run over there and get the mic to you. Would anybody like, first of all, to ask a question? First person, the first brave person, as we said earlier on, to speak. Okay, wonderful. This will be a great workout.
Well, my question is why Britain actually should cut its carbon emissions when, for example, China or India, as growing countries with rising carbon emissions, and the USA, as a highly developed country, don't cut their carbon emissions. Especially the USA, who aren't trying at all to implement any carbon cut policy.
Okay. First of all, it is worth putting the facts on the table. Britain's carbon emissions are about 2% of global emissions. But I've got a moral point and a practical point. The moral point is that historically, we're responsible for an enormous percentage of carbon emissions. We were the first country to industrialise. We have a moral responsibility to take action. Some people don't like moral arguments, so I'll do the practical one, which is the fact that, first of all, I'd like to disagree with you that the US isn't doing anything. The US isn't doing much. That I'll agree with. But, President Obama did actually agree a carbon reduction strategy last year. He did come out and say it. He laid it on the table as a plan of action. It's grossly inadequate as a plan of action, but the US does have a plan of action. But one of the things that demonstrates is in the US, and it's less visible, but also in places like China, in places like Brazil, in places all around the world, there are significant numbers of people all campaigning to change their own country's policies. Those people have varying levels of power, varying levels of visibility. Certainly in China, it's a very tough road to hoe to be an environmental campaigner. But they exist, and they're in there, and they're fighting. And every time Britain, every time Europe takes a step in the right direction, that gives more power to their elbow too. So if we make, if we go, for example, for a full decarbonisation of the electricity supply by 2030, that will really help them push for similar measures in their countries. So although the impact we can have on actual carbon emissions in our own country, sure, on a global scale isn't that big, we can have a very big political multiplier effect around the world. And, given we were the first to start pumping out that carbon dioxide, we really do have a responsibility to lead on this one.
Thank you. Another question from the floor. Well, this is really going to be
this is like if you're
Pass the mic along.
If we're going to stop importing Peruvian beans and South African apples, will you increase the foreign aid budget to make up for the loss in global trade for less developed nations?
I'm going to start this by responding by quoting probably the best summary I've ever heard on this issue it was actually at a parliamentary breakfast I was at recently, from the UN rapporteur on the right to food. This is a man who spends his entire life thinking about people going hungry. And he said, we have to change the global agricultural system and the basis of export-led markets in the developing world to tackle hunger in the developing world. Because what they should be growing is not peas or beans or apples or whatever for us. They should be growing food for their local market, food to feed their local people. And I was talking about a strong local economies here in Britain. We also desperately need strong local economies that money goes round and round in, in places like Kenya, which has been absolutely environmentally and economically decimated by the cut flower industry, for example. Those kind of export-led industries have caused immense environmental and economic harm. And I may be sounding quite passionate about this. It's partly because last night at Trinity College I was debating an economist who thought that sweatshops were a really good thing and there should be lots more of them in places like Cambodia. And I may not have entirely got my reaction to that out of my system. But, thinking about those Cambodian sweatshops and thinking about the workers in those agricultural fields, those Cambodian sweatshops are something I know quite a bit about. And they suffer regularly from mass fainting fits, where the staff, the workers, are all so poorly fed that they just faint from hunger because they can't afford to buy enough food to feed themselves. And what we need is to make sure that the food is being grown locally for them at prices they can afford. And that's not to say I'm not talking about autarky or anything like that. I mean, I happen to own, I'm not carrying it today, but I happen to own a handbag that's made in Indonesia from recycled bicycle tyres at a fair trade basis. I'm aware I may be stereotyping myself here slightly, but that kind of trade, specialist, high value, where the workers are paid well, where you can produce some kind of specialty product. Don't want to stop that at all. And I do personally, like my morning coffee and the occasional banana, and we're never going to grow either of those in Britain. But the basics, the bulk, the core commodities need to be grown and supplied locally and ensure that everybody gets enough. Because, we've been following our current model now for decades, and on average, 1 billion people in the world go to bed hungry. This hasn't worked. We need to try another model.
Okay, questions? Wonderfully, one from the front here. That's the red spray.
This may be a bit of a silly question, but could you please explain where our national debt comes from? Who does Britain owe money to? Because I've never worked that out.
Oh, I feel like I'm back in economics again. We owe money partly to ourselves, mostly to financial institutions, to large tax havens. The debt is there. I wouldn't say that we don't ultimately have to repay it, but what I would say is that the idea that repaying our debt is the be-all and end-all of all of our problems is an absolute misnomer. And one of the sort of difficult issues with this is, Margaret Thatcher was famous for this. I've said Margaret Thatcher twice in an evening. The idea that a country's money debt is like that of a household. You've got a certain amount coming in, you've got to pay out a certain amount going out. We can, and indeed we have been, it's called quantitative easing, been printing vast amounts of money, or at least printing large amounts of dots on a computer screen, which these days amounts to much the same thing. And more than 90% of that money has gone to the 10% of richest people. So we can choose to create more money in Britain, and we can choose what to do with it. And Caroline Lucas at the Green MP talks a lot about green quantitative easing. We could create more money and use it to do the kind of things like home insulation, like renewable energy investment that we need. So this control of our economy is actually in our own hands if we choose to take it.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay, over there.
I should say, if you want similar exercise to this, do come leafleting. You don't have to join a gym if you go leafleting.
Oh, I've done my time.
Okay, I'm French, so one of my languages, that's good.
It's better than my French.
In France, since 25 years, we have been running the politics, you want to know, in England. Better healthcare, trying to bring back manufacturing, trying to fight the retirement issues, all this policy to put food on the table, and we can see now those results. They don't work. That's why I'm asking you, as we can see those policies don't work, so why and how? Why do you want them for England, and how do you think they can work here? And why, if he knows that those policies don't work, model here.
Okay, I'll begin this by saying that I don't claim to be an expert on the French economy over the past 25 years, but my general understanding in terms of particularly manufacturing is the focus has been on big companies and on traditional things like car manufacturing, those kind of issues. But also, I'm going to park discussion of the details of the French economy, which I'm not an expert on, and talk about how the world is different now to it has been over the past 25 years. And actually, if you've got access to a subscription to the Financial Times, if you search within the Financial Times the terms reshoring, you'll find out a lot more about what I'm about to talk about. Reshoring is the opposite of offshoring. Offshoring was taking of jobs, manufacturing, all of that off to other countries. One of the most famous examples is when you take call centres off to India. I'm sure we've all got some personal experience of how well that works. But what we're seeing is what the FT calls reshoring, and that's the natural return, not the product of any government policy or any decision, but the natural return of particularly manufacturing to Britain. And if you actually read the FT, they talk about how if you buy a women's jacket, I'm not sure about men's jackets, but women's jacket priced between about £80 and £200, it will almost certainly be made in Britain. And that's a reflection of various economic facts. One, that wages in China are going up enormously. Wages in China this year are predicted to rise by 18%. 18%. Something to imagine as a long-distant dream for the rest of us. So Chinese wages are very fast approaching the levels of Western wages. And of course, they've also, as a result of the one-child policy, have a situation where the supply of young factory workers has vastly fallen off compared to what it was a decade or two. So you've got rising wages, you've got rising transport costs. So basically the price of fuel has doubled, and it's not going to go back down again, and the price of transport has basically doubled. And you've also got the situation where a few years ago, the big thing for people who were doing MBAs and all of that was, what you wanted was a just-in-time, complex supply chain driven by value. So what you do, if you're putting together a complex item, you get one bit of it made in Japan, you get one bit of it made in Korea, you get one bit made in India, and you get one bit made in Africa, and then you just in time bring them all together, assemble it and ship it off to your market just in time. And actually, since things like Fukushima, since some very bad floods in Thailand that didn't get much publicity here but were absolutely huge in manufacturing terms, it suddenly occurred to all these genius MBAs that having long, complex, global, just-in-time supply chains was a bit risky. They could go wrong, spectacularly wrong, be unable to supply things for months wrong. And so there's three factors that are different to they've been in the past couple of decades. The level of developing country wages, the fact that transport costs have gone up and are only going to keep going up, and the fact that long, complex supply chains suddenly look very risky. So the situation we're in now is not the situation we were in 10 years ago. And the other thing you mentioned was retirement ages. Now, again, I'm not an expert on the French system of funding retirement, but I do know what it's like in Britain, and I do know that we have a government that's saying that you, indeed, for me it's only about mid-60s, but all of you are theoretically going to have to continue working until you're at least age 70. Now, if you have a nice, cushy office job that you actually really enjoy, maybe that mightn't be that bad. But think about a nurse who's lifting patients regularly, or a physiotherapist who's got a hard physical job, or indeed the more obvious things like a guy who's doing ditches by the side of the road. All of those kind of jobs. A teacher, even. I know what hard work it is. I'm a school governor and I sometimes watch teachers in action. And keeping the control, interest and focus of 25 5-year-olds is something that takes an awful lot of energy. I don't think I could do it now, and I certainly can't imagine doing it when I'm 70. So the kind of idea of this extension of everybody going to 70 just doesn't make any sense. It's not logical. What we need to do is create a situation where we have a different kind of retirement system. What we need to do is have, rather than one day you're at 5 days, 40-hour-a-week work, the next day you're retired, allow a gradual wind down, allow much more labour market flexibility, allow people to step into different things, do things part-time and still get some state support. We need something that acknowledges the fact that different people are in different places in their health and their well-being. So we need something quite different, but some kind of blanket 70 is quite frankly absolute nonsense.
Okay, thank you. Just before I take another question from the floor, can I also encourage people, not only, there's lots of tweeting going on here, but not so much formulated in terms of questions, so it'd be nice to get some questions there for the more shy amongst you. So not just comments are great, questions as well, which a response to be given. Can I take another question from the floor? Can I just get this gentleman because he's putting his hand on the floor?
I just wanted to ask, you talked about, what was it? You talked about raising taxation levels for the top 1%. I'm going to say it's probably more realistically 5 or 10, roughly speaking. I wanted to ask, within economic theory, and we've seen it in practice before, what areas of the top 10% would you tax more? Would you tax people that are rich but they don't provide much to society, maybe famous entertainers or people who work on the BBC or something? Yeah. Or like something vital, like...
Don't tell I won't quote Andrew Neil, that one.
Yeah, but, or something more vital, like say a major supermarket branch that is responsible for millions of jobs all across the country and for supplying food to millions of people. And the other thing I want to ask is, if you're going to tax those types of people, are you worried about the effects it's going to have on the employees due to sticky wages theory? Most of them will get laid off. So I want to ask, if that does happen and you do this, how are you going to deal with that sort of a problem?
Okay, well I think I referred to the 1% in different contexts, so that wasn't talking about taxation. To be concrete in terms of in 2010, we had a general election manifesto that had a top rate of 50% tax that kicked in at £100,000 income and above. Just to put some figures on this, I think we will certainly have a higher percentage in our 2015 manifesto, probably kicking in at the same kind of level, I suspect. But I think, well, I'll come to your point actually in terms about the question about workers being laid off. This is, most of you in this room are probably quite small, but those who do remember the introduction of the minimum wage, we were told introducing a minimum wage would create mass unemployment. We had people who were on, who suddenly got a £2 an hour pay rise because they was that far below what was introduced as the minimum wage. And all of the economists agree that introducing the minimum wage had absolutely no impact on employment. The fact is that you've actually got a spending side of increased wages as well as a cost side. And I think if you think about this in very concrete terms, you think about Joe's Corner Cafe, and you think about the street sweepers who are working outside Joe's Corner Cafe. Maybe now, if they stretch it a bit, they might be able to go in and afford 50p cup of tea. But a cake is out of the question. You lift their wage up to a living wage level, they might occasionally think about buying a cake. The fact is that people at the bottom of the income distribution spend all of their money on essentials. That's why they're ending up in food banks, because they haven't got enough money to live on. If you give them more money, they will spend it mostly in their local economy, mostly on essentials that they're just not able to buy now. So what you actually get is a boost to business, a boost locally, hopefully mostly. But in terms of the tax reform, we have to make multinational companies pay their taxes. We have this really quite funny, if it wasn't so sad, situation where we have companies offering that they'll pay some tax just because they feel like it. Because it's really doing them lots of PR harm not to be paying tax, so they'll just hand over a bit of cash. And that can't be a situation that continues. You have situations with companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, who simply are not paying any tax. And yet they're using all of the resources that all of our taxes pay for. The hospitals, the schools, the roads I was talking about earlier.